This video is about telling the other side of the story of the transatlantic slave trade, a story rarely ever talked about, a story about African chiefs who risked their lives to try to stop the slave trade. Very often, when the subject of the transatlantic slave trade is talked about, you tend to hear about Africans selling their own into slavery, which is often taken out of its historical context, and is also very one-sided in the story of what happened during the slave trade. The purpose of the one-sided taken out of context story is to shift blame of the slave trade from the European and direct it towards the Africans, and or take heat off the perpetrators of the slave trade, making it appear Africans were equally as guilty of the slave trade as Europeans. Well, this video is created to help bring more balance in the story of what happened during the slave trade. What's often not mentioned about the transatlantic slave trade is the fact that initially, Europeans would go on slave raids kidnapping Africans from coastal areas, but that was too risky for them because Africans were fighting back and it would result in many Europeans getting killed in those raids. So Europeans decided to use much less riskier tactics to get African slaves. In some cases, they would use their missionaries to bring Christianity to the African chiefs, convince them that Christianity is the superior religion and would make their nation richer and more powerful. And that would convince some African chiefs to convert to Christianity. Then the European missionaries would ask the African chiefs to sell them their prisoners of war as repayment. Some African chiefs thought the European missionaries was gonna use them as temporary workers, indoctrinate them into Christianity, and then bring them back to Africa. But very often that was not the case. Also, in many cases, Europeans would create division and fighting between African tribes, so they would fight and sell each other into slavery. They would very often bring presents, so they would gain trust among some Africans. Some Africans felt because they gave them gifts, they must be nice, honest individuals. Then Europeans would spread lies about other tribes, then arm them with guns and use them to capture other Africans. And while the Africans they brainwashed was kidnapping other Africans to sell into slavery, European slave raiders would target Africans from weak tribes to kidnap. And in some cases, Europeans would use Africans they brainwash to assist them in capturing other Africans. The Africans being attacked, their spears was no match against the gun of the Europeans and the brainwashed Africans they used against them. So some Africans were forced to sell other Africans in order to purchase guns from European gun dealers, so those same Africans would have a chance at defending themselves from Europeans and their brainwashed African allies who were helping them capture slaves. But the problem was that the European gun dealers were loyal to the European slave raiders, so they would only sell Africans old, outdated, slow-firing guns that had to be reloaded after every single shot is fired, and West Africans lacked the experience on how to use them and was not aware that the gun had to be cleaned after a little while. While the European gun dealers would give Europeans the latest, most advanced guns as well as cannons, and the European would train their African servants on how to use them. As a result, the Africans who purchased the guns from European gun dealers would wind up being defeated easily by Europeans and their brainwashed African allies. Also, in some cases, African chiefs would be threatened with enslavement by the European if they did not provide black slaves to the European. Some African chiefs would submit to the demand of the European out of fear of themselves and their tribe being enslaved by Europeans, but later the European would still have them and their tribes kidnapped and sold into slavery. What's usually not mentioned is the African chiefs who fought against the slave trade, which was the majority of them. And these are some of the many African chiefs who lost their lives or their freedom as a result of fighting against the slave trade. King Ansa. King Ansa was the leader of the Fante people of modern-day Ghana. He was a militant abolitionist who, on 1470 to 1486, he enacted a federal policy where Fante watchmen would patrol the Ethiopian ocean coast and search for slaver ships. Their job was to do everything in their power to prevent these ships from landing on shore, even if it meant killing all the terrorists on board. Many other African leaders did not permit European in their kingdoms in their Benin nation. The people had heard of the intentions of the Europeans, so there was a federal policy enacted by the Oba for all citizens of the nation to kill all the European terrorists as soon as they came ashore. King Nzenga Maremba. African King Nzenga Maremba tried to stop the slave trade in the Congo only after he originally participated in the trade, in exchange for military items and support from Portugal. King Maremba agreed to release his African prisoners of war to the Portuguese, who wanted the best young African men as a bargaining chip. To be sure, the king kept his word. The Portuguese promised to train and educate the young men to become priests and later to return them to the Congo. King Maremba let the Portuguese convince him to take the Christian name Alfonso as a show of support. When Alfonso asked for the return of a few of his former prisoners who had been trained to serve as physicians, surgeons, pharmacists, assistants for shipbuilders and carpenters, his requests were denied. After having his requests denied several times, King Alfonso learned that his prisoners of war had been sold as slaves in Portugal. In 1526, King Alfonso wrote to King John III, the former king of Portugal, and asked for his help in ending the slave trade in the Congo. He explained the freedoms that were given to the Portuguese, who had set up shops, become merchants in the Congo, and amassed fortunes. The people in the Congo could not do the same because they had complied with the agreement and now did not have the same abundance of wealth as the invaders. King Alfonso related that the damage was so great that his people and land were being seized daily. King Alfonso ended his letter to King John III with another request for his help because it was the will of the people in the Congo and other kingdoms that there should not be any trading of slaves nor markets for slaves. King Agaja. In 1777, King Agaja, who was a king in Dahomey, which is today part of the African country called Benin, captured an Englishman and his slave raiding party who had entered his kingdom looking for more Africans. The Englishman and his crew were released after they promised to return all the Africans they had captured. King Agaja gave the Englishmen a warning to take to the rulers of England that if any other slave traders were sent to his kingdom or other kingdoms, they would be killed. Abdel Kader Kane. Another prominent West African abolitionist was Abdel Kader Kane of the Futa Toro region in northern Senegal. His kingdom was largely populated by people he had freed from captivity. He went on to ban slave caravans from passing through his territory. He sent a letter to the governor of St. Louis after the French kidnapped 3 children from his territory. The letter said, "We are warning you that all those who will come to our land to trade will be killed and massacred if you do not send our children back." Would not somebody who was very hungry abstain from eating if he had to eat something cooked with his blood? We absolutely do not want you to buy Muslims under any circumstances. I repeat that if your intention is to always buy Muslims, you should stay home and not come to our country anymore. Because all those who will come can be assured that they will lose their life. Queen Nzinga. The Portuguese started the transatlantic slave trade with Africa during the 15th century when they began kidnapping people from the continent's west coast and transporting them back to Europe. That enabled Portugal to become a global empire because of their use of slave labor in gold mines and on sugar plantations. But in the late 16th century, England and France threatened Portugal's dominance in the slave trade in northern and western Africa. The Portuguese began to seek new areas of exploitation, mainly in the Congo, Angola, and Southwest Africa. What they didn't expect to face there was an outstanding Angolan queen named Nzinga, who refused to surrender without a fight. In the decades that followed, she shaped the struggle against colonial forces in Africa. Nzinga had two sisters and a brother, but she was greatly favored by her father, who allowed her to witness his governance of the kingdom and often carried her with him to war against Portuguese invaders. Over the years, she became a great warrior, a skilled hunter, an excellent diplomat, and a politician like no other. She was very intelligent and quickly learned to speak and write fluent Portuguese. Nzinga's life forever changed after her brother Angola Mbandi took over the throne in 1617. She became a special emissary in negotiations with the Portuguese, who had already taken many people into slavery. In 1622, her brother sent her to the city of Luanda to negotiate peace treaties with the Portuguese. It is said that she was refused a seat by the Portuguese governor, but she didn't want to look inferior in the eyes of the governor, so she sat on the back of one of her servants for the rest of the meeting. A treaty was signed with the Portuguese, and Nzinga converted to Catholicism, taking the name Dona Ana de Souza. The Portuguese never honored the treaty, though, and King Angola Mbandi committed suicide. Nzinga became queen of Ambandu. She refused the Portuguese demands for slave trade concessions and made it clear that her people would not surrender without a fight. The Portuguese attacked and burned down the capital of the Mabundu kingdom, so Nzinga and her people were forced to retreat. They moved to the mountains, where they reorganized and again formed an army. She later established a kingdom within the territory of Matamba, where she formed alliances with other tribes against the Portuguese and offered sanctuary to all escaped slaves and Portuguese-trained African soldiers. In 1641, she established a strategic alliance with the Dutch to fight off the Portuguese and seize Luanda. It was one of the first African-European alliances. By 1629, Queen Nzinga had established a colony within the region Matamba, from which she hoped to either defeat the Portuguese or to convince them to enter a peace treaty. She began lobbying for the kingdom to take in refugees from the slave trade, and with the help of her rather impressive harem of Dutch soldiers, attempted to cut off slave trade routes, often by force, realizing too that Matamba's location made it well suited for trade. Queen Nzinga also cultivated the kingdom's commerce. By 1656, the Portuguese finally threw in the towel. For the last decade or so of Queen Nzinga's life, her people avoided European colonialism, a success that outlived the Queen herself, in fact. While it wouldn't be until 1975 that the entirety of Angola achieved independence, its continued fight was rooted in Queen Nzinga's legacy. She died in 1663, well into her 80s, and is remembered as a fierce and persistent leader who is honored throughout Africa. These are some of the many African kings and queens who fought against the slave trade. If you would like more information about Africans fighting against the slave trade, these are some of the good books to read. Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. West African Resistance, the Military Response to Colonial Occupation by Michael Crowder. And Fighting the Slave Trade, West African Strategies by Sylvia A. Diouf. I will be posting links to these books. Please rate, comment, and subscribe.